Welcome to another episode of Viral Weather from the Weather Network. Good lineup of guests today. Kim Court is the Director of Catastrophe Exposure Analysis at the Northbridge Financial Group in Vancouver, British Columbia. Dr. Ashley Chute is Assistant Professor at the University of Toronto. She's a doctor and she's a mathematical modeler. Our Chief Meteorologist, Chris Scott, is very familiar with mathematics and models. Models have a lot to do with our weather, with climate change, with chasing diseases, don't they, Chris?
They do, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because as a meteorologist, I deal with models all the time. And I think, first of all, we talk about what is a model. Well, a model, you're really trying to represent something that's happening. And by representing that, try to make a prediction. And in weather, of course, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to predict what it's going to be tomorrow, sunny, rainy, and knowing all of the science and math that goes into that, I never think of it as being an exact answer, but all of my friends, all of my family just goes, is it going to rain tomorrow? So what Kim and Ashley do, they're in that sphere of risk and probability, and it's all math, but even at a grade 3 level, kids learn, is something really likely to happen or not likely to happen? And I think that's what we're talking about today. So maybe, Ashley, can you describe then what you do with models, and as an infectious disease epidemiologist, of course, right now, this is fascinating. This is what everyone is looking for, is what's going to happen next.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, when I talk about my job, I often refer a lot to weather models because I think people understand them more, and they understand, one of the really interesting things about any sort of model, it's a simplified version of reality, whether we're describing how a disease spreads or the chance that it's going to rain tomorrow. But one of the really important things is that we can use them to help describe uncertainty. And I think people are much more comfortable with that when it comes to weather. If you say there's a 60% chance of rain, people kind of get that. I think one of the things that's interesting with disease modeling, and I'll answer your question in a second, but is that people they seem to demand a bit more precision from them than they do from weather models. So I like to often invoke weather models when I talk about what I do. But basically what we do as infectious disease modelers is we use math. We can use, pretty simple math, relatively simple math, to try and describe how diseases spread in populations. And so you can describe those processes pretty well using a few lines of math. And basically, we talk about how people who are susceptible come into contact with people who are infectious. And basically, that process is enough to be able to capture what we call epidemic dynamics. So basically, what most of us are used to seeing right now, which is an epidemic curve, where you introduce disease into a population, you see cases increase. At a certain point, we get down the other side of that epidemic curve, and we can describe that using math and using models.
So the kind of what you deal with are two inputs, how the germs are going to behave and then how the human beings are going to behave.
Yes, yeah. So the human factor is the big, I guess, X factor when it comes to disease modeling, because it can be really, really hard to anticipate how humans behave. And that's, the one unknown. And we see that a lot with any infectious disease. We're seeing that right now with COVID-19. As we try to anticipate what's going to happen, we have to not only understand the disease and, its characteristics, but we also have to understand how humans interact. Right now, across a lot of the world, we have some pretty strong public health measures in place. And those behaviors and the sort of actions that people are doing, whether it be staying at home, whether it be washing their hands or wearing masks, those actually influence our projections. Because if people adhere to those, we're going to reduce transmission. And if they get tired of these measures and stop doing them, that will have an impact and will feed back in terms of what we see with the transmission of disease.
I have huge sympathy for you, Ashley, because obviously with weather, we don't have to worry about people. When it comes to climate change, yes, that's one of the huge uncertainties. Is you've got all of this science that's uncertain, and then you've got how we're going to react to that and what our input into the atmosphere will be. But in weather, it doesn't really matter what's going on a daily basis because it's all about the science. You must tear your hair out sometimes when the models go in different directions and people say, just give me the right answer. How do you communicate that when people are looking for the best answer?
So I think one of the biggest challenges is, working in public health, when we do things well, things don't happen. And so you build a model and you say, we're going to have X number of cases if we don't react. When you put that model out into the universe and you show that to people, that tends to spur people into action. And so then we have what we call, counterfactual scenarios. We have the reality that we see unfold, and then we can use a model to say, well, this is what might have happened had we not reacted. But it's really hard to communicate that to the public. And it's hard for people to understand that, we basically have these parallel universes that could unfold depending on whether or not we had acted. And so it's an interesting problem.
Kim, we were talking about, we model for weather, we model for the way diseases migrate. In your business, do you model for like a pandemic and how that has impacts?
Certainly. I mean, we are very interested in all kinds of catastrophes, be it weather-related, viral, or man-made. And what we're trying to do from that is along the lines of what Ashley's doing. We're taking mathematical input, how the rate of spread increases, how populations are located, and all of those scenarios, and running them to identify, one, are we lining up with the policy and the mathematical models coming out of the epidemiological community, and past experience. Now, this is a fairly unprecedented event, so there's not a lot of experience around this, but there have been several models that have been released to try to quantify the economic loss around that. And again, models, so there's a very wide range of results that we're seeing from that in terms of what the impact will be to national economies, to insurance companies, to regular businesses. And it's been interesting because I feel like this has been one of those groundbreaking moments. For every model, there is an event that results in a growth in industry. And I think that this COVID-19 scenario is certainly that for pandemic modeling.
And we should set the record straight. There's not just one model out there. There's like a dozen models that are being used on this. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And they're all using different inputs. They're all using different propagation methodologies. They're all using different financial calculators to do that, which is one of the things that we really need to consider when we're developing what we call a view of risk. So which view do we think best represents the scenario at hand?
What are some of the scenarios that you see in your crystal ball?
Well, I mean, you kind of put it into different buckets. There's our real world scenario where we think that people are doing exactly what they should be doing, and there's a mix of people who are not doing exactly what they should be doing. And it's how you move those toggles. So, I mean, similar to how we view weather, should all of the storm fronts align, should this pressure system move through, then we can make predictions based on that. So it's a really dynamic model in that we have to change the factors and turn the knobs and dials as we are going through to determine how the end result will look. And so whether people are following the rules, whether there's a mutation in the virus and it becomes more virulent, those are the types of knobs and dials that we're turning at this moment.
So Ashley, I mean, coronavirus is 19 is really interesting because I mean it is like a chameleon oftentimes, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has sort of extremes. It's this very stealthy virus. It can be transmitted without people having symptoms, and then you have really severe outcomes in certain populations. And so, we've seen that as the pandemic has spread in Canada as, devastating impact in institutional settings, particularly in long-term care homes. And then at the other side of that, we have, we think a fair amount of transmission that's happened in people who don't even know that they've been infected. And so that component of it is I think what's keeping us on our toes in terms of trying to anticipate where it's going to go next. We're starting to see outbreaks now amongst migrant workers and farmers. And so, I think that's one component of it that's really tricky. One thing that I wanted to sort of jump in and ask you all about is one thing that's been evolving here in terms of, talking about how there being so many different models and different ways of modeling this. One thing that we've been seeing is something that's called ensemble models, which is basically sort of aggregating all of these different models that people are building and using that to try and get a good sense of what's happening. And in general, those seem to be better predictors than an individual model. And my understanding of that is that's something that's taken from weather forecasting. I don't know if you can speak to that.
I think Chris can, because that's his expertise.
Exactly. It's back in the 80s, actually. So 40 years ago is when those really started to become known and used. And it's all about computing capacity too, because to run all these models, there's a lot of math, and people don't like to do all the equations, but computers are good at them. So the state of the art science now is there's a couple things. You want to run the highest resolution model possible to try to resolve the weather, figure out what's going to happen at a thunderstorm scale. But then you want to also figure out at a large scale, what's the spread of possible solutions? So you're exactly right. We're trying to get the best overall forecast, and most of the time an average of all these models is the best. The problem is it doesn't always work. So most of the time it's good, but in extreme cases, a lot of the times that average will miss. And I'm sure that's a major issue with pandemics as well.
So, Chris, do we have at the Weather Network, when we do this ensemble, what are the models that we chug together that when we create our forecast? Because ours can often be different from Environment Canada or the National Weather Service or any of the other weather providers, right?
Exactly. So we use a number of different models. So first of all, as Kim was discussing, there's a number of models. And when we talk about them in weather, and some people have heard these when they're listening to our presenters, we talk about the European model, the American model, the Canadian model. And in weather, sometimes people think, oh, that's just for Europe. No, weather, just like pandemics, is global. So what happens in Russia and China 10 days later affects what happens in Ottawa and Halifax, just like what's happening in South Korea, in Australia, and India from a pandemic standpoint will impact what's happening in Canada. So everything is global, and each of these countries often has a weather model. I'm sure in pandemic situations with epidemiological modeling, there's many. But yeah, what we're doing, we're bringing all of those in, and sometimes within those models, they run 50 different ones that then they just tweak the data slightly. So as we know with modeling, I think Ashley described it really elegantly. We're trying to represent reality in a simplistic fashion, but to do that, we need data. We can't just have fantasy. You've got to know what's going on. And I guess, my question to you, Ashley, first is, when this pandemic was starting, did you find the models weren't very good because there was a lack of data being input in, say, late January into February?
Yeah. I think that was a huge challenge. Was early on, we, just in terms of characterizing the virus, we didn't know what it was. We hadn't seen it before. And so a lot of these early models were assuming that it behaved similarly to SARS, or that the virus behaved similarly to influenza. And I think, the assumption that it was similar to SARS or other known coronaviruses was one of the reasons that we didn't quite capture the dynamics or the challenges that we were going to face with COVID-19, specifically related to like the severity of disease, the fact that, we have less severe disease than with SARS, and also this asymptomatic spread, or the fact that people can spread infection before they're symptomatic, which is very different from SARS. And so, early on, when we thought that it would be containable within China, that was really based on our experience with SARS. And once we got more information about SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, that really changed the models, because it became clear that if you have people who can spread disease who aren't symptomatic, it's going to be much more challenging to control. And that really changed our approach to different public health responses.
Correct me if I'm right, your models use people who are susceptible, people who are infected, those who are recovered or dead, and those who are immune. That's basically, those are the ingredients that you pop into a model, right? But let's go back through this uncertainty with the way COVID has behaved.
Yeah, for sure. So on its face, it's pretty simple to build a mathematical model of disease transmission. But once you dig into it, it can get really, really complicated. And you have all of these different data elements that can be hard to gather and to understand. And so one of the early on, when we were trying to model COVID-19 transmission, just characterizing the virus and how it spreads and, what infection looks like in humans was, we were starting basically from zero. We could draw analogies with flu and with original SARS coronavirus to try and sort of estimate those parameters that go into the model, but they weren't quite right. And so, the biggest one was just in terms of severity of disease and the fact that people are getting in general are getting less sick, with COVID-19 relative to SARS, and also the fact that people are able to spread disease when they're not necessarily showing signs of illness. And we're still figuring this out. We're not. It's SARS, or sorry, COVID-19 hasn't been with us for very long. And, we're still trying to really understand how the disease infects people, how people are transmitting. And, we understand much more today than we did, 5 months ago, 6 months ago.
Well, and Kim, you were talking about like the integrity of the data, right? Which is so critical.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the key to building any good model or any model at all, is you have to base it on the information that's available. And whether it's, learning how to build a hurricane model and what that looks like, or a pandemic model, the data integrity and the data quality and the frequency of the data obtained is key to building that model. And I mean, obviously there's a time feature that we need to worry about with respect to COVID-19, because getting those models as accurate as possible, as quickly as possible, is a benefit globally. But the goal really ultimately is to get this high resolution data to explain how is this going to change? How is this going to manipulate? How is this going to impact the existing population as it is? And without those key pieces of data, it's difficult to build a comprehensive and accurate model.
Do you think that there's been clarity from all of the nations that have been providing data to fuel your models?
I think that's difficult. I think that it obviously depends on the resources available. The first people who are responding to these events are obviously not focused exclusively on data gathering for this, for these reasons. They're looking to, in COVID-19, cure the people, or treat the people, I should say, who are impacted by it. And it's only after the fact. And I think that that's part of why it seemed like the early models were not necessarily as accurate as they could have been, maybe not as indicative of the rate of spread that we were expecting, because it was only after the first few waves had gone through China that it became clear that this was a much faster moving virus than anyone had initially anticipated. And as those data points started coming in, it became clear that timeliness was certainly a driving factor in developing the model.
Is the outlier in this, Ashley, that you see now, perhaps the fact that there are so many people who are asymptomatic with COVID?
I think that's an important piece of that. I mean, there's ongoing debate even in terms of this in the scientific community around this asymptomatic versus pre-symptomatic. So you may be symptomatic and then go on to develop symptoms, or you may be mildly symptomatic. I think that's a big challenge. And to get back to Kim's point, this is the thing that's really important to remember with infectious diseases or any sort of health modeling, is that, we're not collecting data for the purposes of modeling. We're basically using data that's being collected for other purposes and trying to make it fit our needs. And so, we don't have the luxury of, going out and sampling every person in the world every day and, testing them for virus and checking their viral load. So you sort of have to use the data that you have at hand and, be a bit creative with using it. My team, we refer to ourselves as data raccoons, because we basically, we go through whatever data we can get. Some of it's kind of garbage, but we do with it what we can. And, that's another piece of this, is if you have sort of not great data going into a model, what's coming out of that is not going to be particularly good. So you have to, sort of, first of all, acknowledge that, you have to use the data that you have at hand, but also, be creative about how you analyze that, and also recognize the limitations there.
You're watching Viral Weather on the Weather Network. Our chief meteorologist, Chris Scott, is here. So is Dr. Ashley Shute and Kim Court. And we're talking about, I know it sounds we're talking about computer models, math and numbers and all of that, but it's very important, Chris, and how we figure out the weather. The Los Alamos National Laboratory in the United States nailed how SARS would behave in 2003 in Toronto. They picked the time that it would peak. They said pretty close to the number of people that would get it and the number of people who were died because of SARS. Of course, they're working on the coronavirus, but you have a really interesting observation about models.
Yeah, so with weather models, we were discussing how we've got all these different ones we look at. We've got ensemble models, which kind of take an average of everything. Back in 2012, the European computer model and weather forecasting really made a name for itself because of Hurricane Sandy. So Hurricane Sandy was the big storm that did this weird loop and hit the New Jersey coast in the US. And 7 days out, which is really impressive, the European model nailed the forecast track of Sandy. So at that point, it was, wow, this European model is the best ever. And well, it is. We use it because it is really one of the best, if not the best, most of the time. It doesn't mean, though, that any one model always gets it right. Because back to something Ashley said, it's about the data you put in. And just like in modeling pandemics, in weather, we can't measure every little block of the atmosphere. We're making assumptions. So I think just throwing it back to Ashley there, make a comment on that, what Chris said about this Los Alamos model and just maybe the similarities with weather forecasting. You're making a lot of assumptions, and sometimes I guess they're right and sometimes they're wrong.
Yeah, no, when I heard that story, the sort of thing that popped to mind was a stopped clock is right twice a day. So, I mean, you know, I think if you put enough predictions out there, you know, eventually you are going to be right, which is not to dismiss that particular model, but just to say that, you know, there's so much uncertainty associated with all of this. And I really do feel that, you know, when it comes to disease modeling, a lot of times it's not so much the precision that we're so interested in. It's more about the qualitative insights that we're getting from them. So, you know, if you have 10 models that are saying, you know, this disease is coming to your backyard, and if you don't do anything, it's going to be pretty catastrophic. I think that's probably more important than saying, well, this model was wrong because it overestimated by 10% how many deaths there were going to be. So I think, you know, focusing on a particular model and saying that, you know, this is the one model that rules them all is probably not going to be particularly useful. And, you know, putting too much reliance in a single model and moving forward with, you know, saying that is the truth is going to be problematic, because we really need to test these models and see how they perform under different circumstances.
So Kim, I mean, in your line of work, like you must use a whole series of different models for every particular scenario. You must have one for like the fire season, one for hurricanes, flooding.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And just if I can for a moment go back to what Ashley was saying, I think that one of the important things to note here is that there's not a lot of experience on which to base these models. So looking at hurricanes is a great example because we can model thousands, we can simulate thousands of different types of hurricanes based on all of the information that we have and say, well, in the past, we've seen this kind of behavior and this is how it reacted in those cases. When we look at pandemics, I mean, if we're being honest, our last major pandemic was 100 years ago. So we're working off 2 data points rather than hundreds of thousands of data points that we can use for things like hurricane modeling, for earthquake modeling, for flood modeling. So no, absolutely. There are so many different types of models for all kinds of hazards available, whether it's pandemic or any of the natural catastrophes like severe convective storm. And just even looking at severe convective storm, evaluating the risk with respect to a thunderstorm or a tornado, which is reliably uncertain, is what one of the jokes we make, is that you don't necessarily know how it's going to behave, but we have these data points far more often to base our models than things like pandemic.
Well, Chris, I mean, we're famous for this at the Weather Network. I mean, we can get a winter storm nailed for the amount of snow and when it's going to start and when it's going to stop. But thunderstorms are a whole nother thing, aren't they? I mean, we're good at them, but.
Yeah, I'm going to use that, Kim, reliably uncertain. That's beautiful. And I think it kind of transitions into something I wanted to ask you, Kim and Ashley, maybe Kim first. Like, what do we know? Because there's a lot we don't know, but what simply put, what do we know about what's happening with the pandemic in a general sense?
I think it depends on your region, certainly. I mean, it depends on where you are. In Canada, what we're seeing is that, and especially out here in BC where I am, we've seen successful flattening of the curve so that these methodologies to limit the spread that the models have predicted have been relatively accurate. And I think what the question is now is how do we move forward and how do we anticipate what the next implications will be of this?
We were kind of just talking about some takeaways on COVID, and Kim was saying, you know, they flattened the curve in where she is in British Columbia. We're starting to do that in other parts of the country. Clearly, social distancing and physical distancing and hygiene works, right, Ashley?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've had, tremendous success across Canada in terms of controlling this. Some places sort of more rapid success than others, but I think in general, we're on the right track. In terms of where we go now, we're trying to reduce our dependence on physical distancing and start, relying more on other strategies, including increasing our ability to test people and do contact tracing as a means of controlling transmission without, the extreme measures of physical distancing and, sort of economic shutdown that we've had over the past couple months. And, I think the one thing that's really important to remember is that the success that we've had has resulted in, far fewer infections than we would have had otherwise. But it also means that we have a highly susceptible population still. And so what that means over the coming months, and particularly, in the fall, as we start talking about having return to schools, is, we're going to have to be really careful in terms of how we, proceed in terms of making sure that, we don't sort of slide backwards in terms of all of the gains that we've made over the last little while, and continue to think about how do we protect our population, because, there is the potential for definitely, there's a lot of talk about waves of this epidemic. I'm not entirely sure that we're still out of our first wave, but, there's certainly the sort of looming prospect of a second wave, given the susceptibility that we have in our population still.
Well, that's what I wanted to find out about, because you hear about this R number a lot. Can you explain that, what the R number is?
Sure. So R is what we're known as the reproduction number. And so the basic reproduction number is for a disease that's completely new to a population where nobody has immunity to it. And basically what it is it's the average number of new cases that an old case causes in a population. So if I were to be infected on average for COVID-19, people infect between 2 and 3 people for each of those original infections. And so what we want to do is, as long as that R is above 1, we experience exponential growth. So I infect 2 people, each of those 2 cases go on to infect 2 people, so on, so on. You have very rapid exponential growth. And that's what makes epidemics scary, because they grow really, really quickly. If you get that R number at 1, then each old case makes 1 new case, and you basically have this sort of steady sort of spread of disease in the population. If you can get it below 1, then you expect the disease to decline and eventually go away. And so that's why we're so focused on R. We want it, ideally, we don't want COVID anywhere. We want it to go away completely. But knowing that we have susceptibility in the population, focusing on that R and trying to keep it below 1 so that we don't experience exponential growth is really important. And that's become something that many places are focused on in terms of understanding where we are in the outbreak and how well we're controlling it.
So where are we with that R number now, approximately?
I think approximately across Canada, we're below 1 right now. And, it varies from region to region and in different settings, but overall, it looks like we are below 1.
And so this is the fear when they always say there'll be a second wave, is that we relax and we, because we're people, fall into our old habits again, and because not everybody has been vaccinated or perhaps had COVID, then it starts to spread again more rapidly.
Exactly, yeah. So when we talk about the reproduction number, there are a couple of different components that go into it. One is how many contacts we have with other people. And that's why physical distancing worked so well, is we're reducing the number of contacts that we have, and that reduces that R number. If we return to normal number of contacts and we don't continue to, practice physical distancing, or we don't continue to wear masks or have good hand hygiene, it doesn't take a lot for that R to go back above 1.
Kim, what do you think in terms of the relationship with weather? Because when we started this viral weather podcast, we were really focused on what's the relationship between weather and the transmission of the disease. And the speculation was, well, hopefully it'll be like other coronaviruses, where there'll be a seasonality and we'll come out of it in the later spring. What's your take on that? What have we seen around the world?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen is that we don't have enough data points to say certainly whether or not weather can be a potential mitigant of this kind of an event. We are looking into that. And I think what we unfortunately have seen is that bad weather seems to limit the spread of COVID-19 because people are staying inside and able to effectively keep distance. So inadvertently, I think there's been a direct link, but not the one we were expecting.
So let's kind of bring this to a conclusion. Christian, when we started this series, from our Weather Network company, Weather Source in Massachusetts, CEO Mark Gibbs was on, and they were making available to everyone around the world who was doing research all of our collected weather data that has been gathered over years. Helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the idea was, well, weather is an input to so many things in our society, but also in terms of disease transmission and in terms of how droplets can spread and how infectious they are in different humidities and temperatures. So, Kim, back a couple months ago, there were a couple of schools of thought. It was, well, going into late spring, maybe this coronavirus will behave like other ones, and there'll be a seasonality to it and a dip. And whether that's happened or not, do we know? And then secondly, what do you think, based on the modeling you've done and the research? I mean, if all else was equal, is January going to be worse than September if there were no differences in policy between those 2 months?
I think that's a really interesting question, and when it just goes back to the knobs and dials you can turn in these types of models. So if we had all of our knobs and dials turned to everybody stay socially distant across the globe, and we run through our normal climate and everything is as usual, does there appear to be a seasonality around COVID? There does, with all of those perfect things in line. So should we maintain our current protocols? Would we expect to have a summer that is relatively free of COVID? Then yeah, and I mean, there are even some models that say, yep, go out and enjoy your summer, because when the seasonality comes around, when we come down to the fall, we can expect a second wave or an increase in the R, if that's your preferred metric. But unfortunately, I don't think that all of our knobs and dials are spread there. So I think we're going to actually see a fairly consistent spread for the next little while, at least.
And then Ashley, so to that, just with your background, obviously in the epidemiology of these infections and what happens, I mean, it's maybe unfair to ask your gut, because I get asked that as a forecaster. I'm like, there's no gut. Like, there's education and experience, but based on your education and experience, how would you answer that about this potential second wave and the fact that should we really be worried about the fall and winter?
I think we should be worried, not to be too pessimistic, but I mean, we have all of the factors that suggest that, we have a lot of susceptibility in the population. We certainly are nowhere near achieving herd immunity. Whatever the drivers are of seasonality, and I think, it's still a little bit of an unknown in terms of how much of this is due to seasonality, but we do know that the disease spreads much easier indoors versus outdoors. And the reality is in Canada that we spend a lot more time outdoors in the summer than we can in the winter. So come the colder weather, we are going to be indoors more. We know that that's going to drive up transmission in the population. So, whether we see, have a bit of a reprieve over the summer and transmission starts in September or November, I don't feel confident, to say that. It really depends on what that looks like in terms of how we return to school, how we return to universities. But I think we can, barring, the availability of a vaccine or something that really changes how we handle this particular virus, we can anticipate that there's going to be an increase in transmission come the colder weather. Whether it be behavioral, whether it be seasonal effects or climate. I think, the other important piece here is that come the colder weather, we also have flu season happening. And so that interaction with flu is something that I think we really need to be concerned about, just in the sense that that's going to increase, first of all, people who are going to hospital who need medical care. And so, if ever there is a season to think about getting vaccinated for flu or getting vaccinated for pneumonia, this would be the season to do it.
I have a quick question on that. It's a simple one, but is it not true that just our immune systems are weaker that time of the year? Or, I know it's maybe just something your mom says, but when our bodies get cold and it's dry and we're worn down, is that part of it too, susceptibility?
I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer that question. I think some of that is a little bit of sort of mom telling you not to go outside with wet hair because you're going to be more vulnerable. I think a lot of it is just, that the climate indoors is different in terms of dry air and there's a lot of stuff going on. And, we've been studying flu for a very long time, and even questions around seasonality and those drivers are hard to answer for flu. So answering them for this infection is really, really difficult.
Always a tough one about the flu and the cold at the very end. I want to thank Kim Court in Vancouver, Dr. Ashley Chute in Toronto, our chief meteorologist, Chris Scott at home here at the Weather Network's National Weather Center in Oakville, Ontario. This has been Viral Weather. We appreciate you joining us.